If you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s and you found yourself saying, my metabolism has just stopped, or it's these hormones, I swear they've turned on me, it feels like it's happened overnight, you're not alone. But here's the $1,000,000 question we are unpacking today. Is it really hormonal metabolic shifts of midlife that are causing weight gain? Or is it the subtle compounding changes in habits that sneak up on us and really, again, compound during this time in life? Welcome to the Fitness Simplified podcast. I'm Brooke Davis, women's functional nutritionist and fitness specialist with Elysian Women's Wellness, and I'm here to simplify your fitness. I have Bryce Hamilton joining me today, and he is going to help us unpack the question of metabolism and habit changes. But more importantly, we want to show you what you can actually do about these things. Once an overworked middle school teacher, Bryce witnessed just how often women put themselves last on the priority list, especially when juggling work, motherhood, family demands, all the things, right? And this experience is what really sparked his passion for helping women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s lose fat, build strength, and reclaim their confidence through these simple, sustainable habits that fit real life schedules that we're going to get into today. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on your show. I definitely appreciate the invite, and I'm glad to be here today.
Awesome, awesome. So to start, let's just dive right into what are some of the very first habit breakdowns you see in women coming into this, midlife phase of life, and how do these small shifts start compounding over time?
Yeah, whenever they come to me for help, and probably whenever they come to you for help, there's two big themes that I see that emerge out of that. And that is number one, because they're typically focused on both their careers as well as their families, they're neglecting their own sleep. So sleep is typically the very first thing that I notice. And then the second thing that I notice is that they are also typically attempting to eat as little as possible. And so they have two things kind of working against them. Diet culture has convinced them that what they need to do in order to lose fat is just stop eating. And actually, you'll see this on social media. I don't know if you spent a lot of time on Threads. I've kind of like perused it, but it's funny because it's text only.
Yeah.
And so people ask questions and it's not really, it's kind of unfettered questions because there's no pictures, there's no videos, nothing like that. So somebody will ask like, how do I lose weight? And without any second guessing, I go into the comments and I look for this comment because it's every single time, 100%. Somebody says, well, just stop eating. And I'm like, that's a recipe for disaster. So the
Solid.
two things that is working against them is they are not able to recover from the stressors of their job and taking care of their family because they're robbing themselves of sleep. And then the second resource that they're robbing themselves of, calories in general. And so the way that this kind of compounds over time, and this then kind of shifts over into the psychology of it, in that because they're not sleeping, their hormone regulation is off, specifically when it comes to hunger hormones, ghrelin and leptin. So that's the hunger and satiety hormone, which I just say that for the sake of the listener. Maybe this is the first episode somebody's listening to. So those hormones are off. So they now feel really hungry and their willpower is at an all-time low because they're exhausted. And then they end up eating more than what they believe their allotted calories are. And then they perceive that, well, the reason why I'm not losing weight is because I'm eating too much, but it's because I'm lazy or I'm undisciplined or I'm whatever label they put on themselves. But it's really not their fault. It's because there's just a lack of education out there that when you don't sleep, you kind of can't control your hunger cues as well. Well, you can't control your cues, which means that your ability to make good choices is going to be significantly hindered. And so that individual then feeds themselves this cyclical lie, which is I can't get enough sleep because I have all these things going on in my life. And I also can't lose weight because I don't have the willpower to do so. And that must mean that I'm a lazy, undisciplined person. Because that's another message that we see on YouTube, social media as well, is if you're not seeing results, it's because you're just not putting it in enough work. You're just not grinding hard enough. You're just not getting up early enough. You just don't have the perfect morning routine or whatever crazy thing it is. And then they feed themselves this lie, and then it just goes round and round and rounds, right? Then they try to do more. They do try to exercise more and eat less. And because of that, then their quality of sleep just tanks. And then it just happens over and over again.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here. I'm so excited. Yeah, so poor sleep quality, right? That impacts literally everything in your body. That is, the foundation of wellness and everything working properly. And then nutrients, right? When you start to cut everything out and you're at this insanely low calorie intake, right? 1,200 calories less. I mean, so often see that. And the Facebook comment or the comments in general of some of these group, they're priceless. I'm such a comment reader, like in general. And so of course, these questions I have to go. And I mean, the willpower it takes to not like go in and try and be like, listen. Not that they would at that point anyways, because it's a random thread, but yeah, it's tough. So that low calorie intake though is not just low calorie, that's low nutrients, right? And that is what fuels every system in your body and allows your body to be able to prioritize fat loss and maintain your energy levels and maintain your hormone production. And so that is such a key component to that vicious cycle and partly why it keeps happening. And then the message, right? The limiting beliefs, the stories that women start to tell themselves about why they can't lose weight. That is, I think, one of the most detrimental things, when it comes to what's going around on social media, is that if you can't do this, if you can't stick to this, like you're just lazy, you need more willpower. And when in reality, to unpack that, when you look at other aspects of these women's lives, they're anything but lazy, right? They have probably more willpower than, more people or the majority of people combine in different areas of their life because they have different methods for approaching those things. And so I think unpacking that limiting belief is huge when it comes to looking at tactics for weight loss. So great overview on that. I want to get back to the compounding component, right? Because you mentioned sleep and that does start, right? It starts that vicious cycle. And when women get to their 30s, 40s, everybody's like, oh, it's so much harder to lose weight. What is your insight on, metabolic shifts, that component versus these habitual, actions that actually cause more problems?
So just to clarify, is the question, because there's two different paths that we could take here. One is that the habitual habits cause the problems or the life stage that causes the problems. Because we also know that that's true. When somebody enters perimenopause, that's going to introduce things that they've never faced before versus the habitual action. So kind of which path would you like to take?
So I want to talk about the habits that also contribute to the changes, because everybody's like, oh, that just happened overnight. And while, yes, obviously there are physiological changes that do create, a shitstorm, for lack of a better word, of metabolic chaos, largely we know that their habits are really what have caused a majority of these shifts over time.
Yeah. And so I really prefer to go down that path anyways, because the majority of what we know is down that path. To be honest, when we talk about perimenopause, menopause, we know that that's a tremendously underserved group of individuals because there's just not really any research around it. I mean, there's some, and there's some interest that is starting to drum up in that area, but it's really relatively not that much information when compared to everybody else. But we do know that the habits work, and the habits contribute to what feels like an overnight shift. So let's just say, for example, let's kind of try to relate it back to something we've all experienced. Let's say that maybe you're in high school and you are able in high school to get all the sleep you need, and you're able to get all the nutrients you need because your parents are making your meals for you. you're able to also probably pull off some pretty good grades because the level of difficulty is pretty easy, comparatively speaking, to higher education. Now, it's not easy for everyone. I don't mean to say that, but comparatively speaking, it's easier in high school because it's more general. Whereas when you go to higher levels of education, it becomes super specific and it becomes harder on purpose. So then you graduate high school, you go to college, and now all of a sudden you have to, and it seems like it's overnight, right? That freshman 15 that everyone's like, oh, it's the freshman 15 that I gained. And then the temptation is to think that all freshmen do this. And we could say this is just some inexplicable life stage thing that all freshmen go through. But we know that that's not true because that wouldn't really make any sense. There's nothing else going on physiologically in their life that would cause that. But there is stressors that are being introduced into their life that would accelerate that. So now they're having to prepare their own meals and figure out how to afford it. And so they might have mental stress because maybe they don't have the budget. There's also the time stress because now they're doing 18 hours worth of credit load in combination with trying to find the time to prep meals, in combination with trying to find the time to take care of themselves by going to the gym and those kinds of things. And so it's not that the freshman 15 is because of the life stage. It's because of you didn't have the habits in place that you needed in order to set yourself up for success when it came to that freshman year. Now, it is different when it comes to perimenopause, menopause, and that lifestyle or that life stage shift, because that is not something that you really have any previous knowledge about. So when you're in high school, you could learn how to budget. You could learn how to make your meals. You could learn how to do all those things and then make your transition into college relatively easy. However, the difference is that when somebody enters perimenopause, menopause, they don't have any previous experience, and there's really no way for them to gain that previous experience. It's one of those things that the way that you gain the experience is going through it. And by the time you've gone through it, you don't really need the experience anymore because you've figured out how to go through it. And it only happens once, right? So going back to that example, though, even though you don't have the previous experience, you do know that the habits that make that switch harder need to be in place when that time comes. So it will feel like when you get to that stage, it will feel like it's an overnight switch. But when you compare your habits pre-menopause to post-menopause, they're pretty much the same. So the question is, was it perimenopause, menopause? Partially. Perimenopause, menopause is like taking it from easy mode and then switching it to hard mode. You know, I was talking to one of my clients and she was asking me this question. And I said, do you have any teenagers? And she said, yeah, I have boys. They're actually not teenagers. They're in their 20s. And I said, okay, do they play video games? And she said, yeah. So I said, okay, what happens when your boys switch the video game intensity level from easy to like legendary? And she's like, well, they get destroyed and they get frustrated. I'm like, yeah, that's what's happening. It's that the habits that we know work, so movement, protein consumption, overall calorie management, that those habits were not in place. And then all of a sudden you're going through this life stage and it's like hitting a brick wall. And so if those habits were in place, you would notice a difference, but it wouldn't be this huge, dramatic thing that seems like this ominous monster that's out to devour you. It is real and it does exist, but it's made way worse by the fact that people just are not prepared for it by the time they arrive at that life stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, great analogy for sure. I love that. It's like the shift from high school to college, like that's an external environment that really can't be controlled for. Whereas, you know, the perimenopause menopause shift is like an internal environmental shift that can't be controlled for. But you still have this huge sphere of control that you do have in order to make this transition easier. So great analogy. So how can women start to rebuild those habits when they get to this point of exhaustion, right? Low motivation, hormonal chaos, and they're kind of starting from zero a lot of times. They don't have any of these habits in place. Where is some of the best places to start for that?
Yeah, the place that I like to start all of my clients is that I like to start them with three foundational things. And that is sleep, which we've already talked about. That is hydration, and that is overall movement. And I don't focus on anything else until those things are accounted for and we really see and evaluate what's going on there. Because sure, there's lots of things we can do. We can increase cardio, which in the past there's been a huge emphasis on that, and that is way overplayed. But you could do that. You could introduce strength training. You could introduce macros. You could introduce all these things. But unless you're sleeping and unless you're moving and unless you're drinking water, none of those things are going to have the impact that you think they're going to have. And a lot of people focus on the hard things before mastering the easy things. And I love to see the realization of relief that comes over people's faces when I'm like, oh, well, there's all these things we can do, but right now you're sleeping 5 hours a night. So what I want you to do is I want you to hang it up early and go to bed. And then that's going to make an impact. And I got a message from one of my clients a couple of weeks ago, and she was like, yeah, I did exactly that. I've been focusing on movement. I've been focusing on sleep primarily and hydration. And she was like, today is the first day that I feel like I'm energized, I'm mentally clear, and I'm able to show up to work the way that I want to. And she's a business owner, so that's vitally important for a business owner to be able to be mentally clear by the time they arrive at work. And so those are really the three foundational things that, hey, are you sleeping enough? Are you moving enough? And probably the easiest way to evaluate that is just how many steps are you getting in a day? People put a lot of emphasis on like training for obstacle courses, marathons, all those things. But really, and this is true for me too, the number one non-negotiable in my life is that I walk my dog for like 2.5 miles a day. If I do that, I know that I'm going to get 10,000 steps that day just because of that, plus all the other stuff that I do during my day. And if nothing else happens because of time, then I don't really worry about it. And that's something that's easy to do. And then hydration, that's super important for number one. This is something that all women care about, right? Skin health. So if you really care about the way that you look and you want your skin to be vibrant, drink enough water. But it also helps with digestion, which also will help you mentally when you down the road maybe do start stepping on the scale, right? To see what is that data telling me. Because if we're not digesting food well, that will affect the number on the scale. So for example, a couple weekends ago, it was my sister-in-law's birthday. So we threw a surprise birthday party for her. And it was my birthday 2 days in a row. Her birthday is May 17th, mine is the 18th. And so I ate unashamedly. There's those times in life where you just enjoy the moment, right? And I don't really have fat to lose. And so I didn't really care. So I ate a bunch of things that I otherwise wouldn't eat in my normal life. Well, that caused digestive issues over the next couple of days, and the scale number went up, but it immediately went down, not to be vulgar or anything, but it immediately went down when my bowels started moving again, right? Because those things that caused those blockages were relieved, moved out of the way, the scale went right back down to where it should. And the same thing is true if we're not drinking. I had a client who was drinking like 15 ounces of water a day. And she was, a big coffee drinker, tea drinker, those kinds of things. But, drinking enough water is really key, really vital. And she was telling me 2 or 3 weeks after we started working together, she was like, I'm now using the restroom every single day. Whereas before, I actually can't tell you the frequency because it was infrequent and I was not aware of how big of a difference it was making. She was like, but now I just feel so much lighter and more energized because things are actually working. So I think that to start, those three things are key.
Yeah. Yeah, those are the foundations for overall wellness. And the last key, like you mentioned, obviously skin, energy levels, digestion, and detoxification, right? If you are not excreting all of those things, that is part of how your body gets rid of excess hormones, and environmental toxins, things like that, that will build up in our bodies, and then cause stress on the liver, kidneys, things like that, that are having to filter, right, bind to them, if we're not getting them out. So those are huge movers in the goals of really overall health and wellness, but also fat loss. So very powerful. And what are in this phase, usually again, energy levels are low, and yes, obviously getting more sleep, hydrating, movement, that's going to help. But how do you help them stay consistent with these things long term? Because, a lot of times they'll start something and it's a, 3-week challenge or whatever. But it's making them stick that's the key. So what are your tools to help women do that?
Yeah. So when it comes to making habits stick, this is something that does frustrate probably every single client that starts working with me because they are the kind of person, somebody that's willing to invest in their health, somebody that is willing to invest their time and energy into that, is also somebody that's probably like super mom, super executive, like they're the go, go, go type A kind of person. That's the kind of person that invests in their health. So that kind of person, when they come in, they're like, I want all the stuff.
100%.
Exactly. And the first thing that I do is I give them my education. So my coaching is made up of two parts, which probably yours is as well. And that's the educational side. And then there's the interactive check-in side where I personalize it, right? And so when it comes to the education side, I only allow them access to one singular piece of educational content per week. Because you guys do that as well. And the reason I tell them that, they're like, well, I've watched it. I'm ready to move on to the next thing. And I'm like, yeah, but watching it doesn't matter. It's putting it into practice that matters. And until we can,
Putting it
okay, we're
into
back.
practice.
Yes, because it's not the education that matters. It's putting it into practice that matters. And one of the first things I tell everybody is the fastest way for me to get you to do absolutely nothing is to tell you to do everything all at once. And so let's focus on those three things that I've already mentioned. Once we feel confident in those and once we reap the benefits of those, then let's move on to the next thing. So inevitably, there's going to come a point where somebody puts those three things into practice repeatedly. And I generally shoot for 3 weeks. Hey, let's be consistent with these things for 3 weeks, because that's the point where it's not totally solidified, but it's solidified enough to add something else without being frustrated because you've already been working on that thing for 3 weeks. So then once you've solidified those things for 3 weeks, then you can add something else. And so the next thing that I like to add is, okay, now let's track your protein and not worry about calories, because everyone's used to tracking calories, but not realizing that our preferences play a large role into that. So for example, if I prefer to eat carbs, which I love carbs, if I prefer to eat carbs, it's going to really be difficult for me to keep my calories in check by eating carbs because there's nothing that's signaling satiety in that. So I need to track protein first, then I can add in tracking carbs and fats if I get to that point, right? For most people, I really think that tracking protein and overall calories is enough to give you insight into what your metabolic condition is. Because depending on the capacity that you have in your life, if your life is super busy, maybe you just do one thing. If it's a little bit less busy, because let's be honest, nobody's life is not busy. But if it's a little bit less busy, then maybe you can do up to 3 things. But people are generally good at evaluating whether or not they can take on more. And so, okay, can I take on 1 to 3 things, but not to exceed 3 new things at a time? Because that's when you're going to get frustrated. And then once you can solidify that new thing, then you can look forward to the next thing.
Speaking of frustrated, okay. So monitoring how much you take on at once is obviously so key to that long-term success. If you are trying to take on everything at once, like you said, you get overwhelmed and then you drop it all at once. And that is what happens with most programs that people join, right? That is
Yep.
the common curse. And so I want to talk a little bit about kind of in line of thinking, habit stacking. And you mentioned these three kind of components, but they don't necessarily relate to each other unless you're tying them in somehow. So I am curious if you have any kind of habit stacking, habits, tricks, tips, things that you use to help implement and make those stick also.
Yeah, so when it comes to habit stacking, sleep, I think, is kind of its own thing because it becomes difficult to stack sleep with something else. Sleep is more or less something that we plan for. So we're going to set that one aside. Well, I'll talk about it, but we're going to set it aside when it comes to the concept of habit stacking. So sleep, what I like to tell people is there's so many marketing gimmicks out there that tell you that, hey, you need this other watch, you need this ring, you need this, that, the other thing. And I think that those things are cool. I think that they're cool to increase the efficacy of your sleep like 1 to 3%. But 97% of your sleep is going to come down to this one thing. And it's, did I plan to spend enough time in bed? So the most important thing when it comes to sleep is making sure that you actually spend enough time in bed. So for example, if I know that I want to get 8 hours of sleep, then I need to backtrack that and then think, okay, how can I achieve that? So 8 hours would be 10 o'clock, if I'm waking up at 6, and then making sure that I'm at least conscious of the fact that I need to be making my way towards bed by around 9:30. Now that doesn't mean that I'm fast asleep by that time. It just means that by 9:30 I'm conscious of the fact that I need to be moving in the direction of bed, especially since, again, as we've already mentioned, most people do not fall asleep right immediately when they get to bed. So it's okay to get there a little bit early and just, maybe spend time there in meditation or whatever before even 10 o'clock. So that by the time 10 o'clock hits, you actually are in a state where you're able to fall asleep. I know that for myself, there's times where I toss and turn a little bit. And if I don't do that in a practice, then I know that if I try to start thinking about bed at 10, I'm not going to actually make it there till 10:30, which means I'm probably not going to fall asleep to around 11:15. So even though you might not be asleep by 9:30, and that might seem a little bit early for most people, if you can train that trigger to go off in your mind, like, okay, now I need to at least think about getting ready for sleep and get up off the couch, turn off my screens, those kinds of things at that time. Then when it comes to hydration, I think that one needs to be kind of integrated into the workday. So something that I really discovered was super helpful for me because I tend to be a type A. I will take care of myself once I get everything done. And that did not work for my hydration because I get super dialed in and focused on projects that I'm working on, and I forget to both eat and drink. And so setting those timers throughout the day, okay, if my goal is to get, for example, 64 ounces of water, then once every hour for 8 hours, that timer needs to go off. And I need to drink a cup of water every hour for 8 hours if my goal is 64 ounces. Now, for most people, your goal is probably going to be a little bit higher than that because optimal, right, is about around for most people 1/2 of your body weight in ounces. So for me, I'm closer to 200 pounds. So I need to shoot for like 100 ounces of water. So I might increase the frequency of that. I might say, okay, every half hour, I'm going to drink a certain amount and set my timer accordingly. And I would increase frequency before I increase amounts, because if you're spreading it over an 8 hour period, you want to be mindful of the fact that you don't want to be drinking a ton of water right before you go to bed. Because we all know I just woke up at 4 a.m. and then couldn't fall back asleep, and that disrupts your sleep. So increasing the frequency and setting those timers and getting yourself into that habit and integrating that into your workday. I think that for me, what has been most helpful when it comes to overall movement and just moving more, tracking steps, doing those kinds of things is really a couple things. One would be just getting up a little bit earlier to get like a 10-minute walk in the morning before work, because that's going to do a couple things, right? We all know that when we get up in the morning, that we tend to feel our stiffest at that point, and that's when we really will benefit from movement as much as possible. So in the summertime, I like to go outside and take like a 10-minute walk first thing in the morning, come back, eat breakfast. By that time, I'm actually awake and able to be productive with stuff. In the winter, I have a walking pad that I utilize just because nobody wants to do that in the dark, especially like the street I live on. People drive way too fast, and I'm not doing that in the dark. So take that 10-minute walk on the walking pad. And then if it's possible for me, and I think this is probably possible for most people because you're legally obligated by your employer. And the exception might be if you work for yourself, but you're legally obligated by your employer to have lunch breaks or meal breaks of some kind. And usually they're like half hour to an hour. And so then you can put into that time slot, okay, after I eat, I can then take 10 minutes out of that time slot to just walk. And the same thing after dinner. In the evening, what I like to do is I like to go on walks with my wife because that does a couple things as well. We've both been busy all day and we haven't seen each other. And then it allows us to kind of spend quality time together. We leave our phones at home so that we're not tempted to be like walking down the street doing work. And it allows us to compartmentalize our day, and it helps out our relationship in addition to helping out our health as well, getting in that movement, but it's also accomplishing these other things at the same time. Because I think that's a huge part of the problem is that people view it as I need to get my walk in. And so I'm going to like leave my family and go accomplish that. But there's no rules, right? You can take your family with you and they can have fun with you while you're out there. You can talk about your life. They can talk about school. If you have kids, you know, your spouse can talk about their work day. So there's no rules to getting in these steps. It's just a matter of what is the most enjoyable way for me to stack these in with other things that I'm already doing.
Yeah. Those are amazing tips for implementation. And what I love about them and what we also really try and emphasize, with our clients is integration into your lifestyle versus this, piling on of extra, to-do list. And that's what most people think about when they're like,
Yep.
oh, I really have to get in shape, or I really have to, start doing something. They're like, it's just this extra thing on their to-do list versus things that they can actually do in, very little extra time that not only improve their health, but also, like you said, your relationships, right? And in your sleep, your overall mental well-being, which then makes everything else down the road easier. So, and that is the ultimate goal. So thank you, Bryce, so much for sharing all of that wisdom, so many actionable steps. And like I said, great implementation. I think it's safe to say that anyone listening was probably given kind of a permission slip to just take away the overwhelm of everything that comes along with starting a new health and fitness journey. So if they liked what they heard today, where can they find more of you?
Yeah, the main place that I hang out is over on my podcast, and that you can find that at hamiltonfit.com/podcast, and that'll just take you right over to the Apple Podcast player. And spoiler alert, I look forward to having Brooke on my show here pretty soon. And so you can find me that way. I also hang out on Instagram at rbryce_Hamilton. And so you can find me there as well. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot a direct message, and I'm always happy to interact there as well.
Awesome. Bryce, thank you so much for being here, and go check out his socials and get more of what he has to share.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Fitness Simplified podcast. We are stoked to have you join us on your journey to better health and fitness. If you have any questions, suggestions for future topics, or just want to chat, feel free to reach out to us on Instagram at Brooke_Elysian and Facebook linked in the show notes, or via our website, ElysianWomen'sWellness.com. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we would be thrilled if you could take a half second to leave us a 5-star rating and review. Not only will you be helping others find our show, but you'll also be entered into our monthly $100 giveaway for new reviews. If there was something you heard that was helpful or impactful, please screenshot it, tag me, and share what it was so that we can bring you more. Plus, you'll be entered into our monthly Legion Recharge post-workout giveaway. So make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Thanks for listening.